Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This is part 2 of the two-part series, Visions of Hachiman. Now, part 1 of this series, so video 1, discussed who is Hachiman, what is Hachiman. And I showed was that a brief history of Hachiman Daibosatsu, and that Hachiman is a Dharma protector, a Buddhist protector, and is the clan god, the Ujigami, of the Genji. In that video, we also took, like I said, we took a brief look at the history, and we also addressed some misconceptions, and I explained ultimately the importance of the deity to the Genji. So, the Tada Genji tradition is well rooted in devotion to Hachiman Daibosatsu. Many rituals are done within the tradition in relation to this devotion. So like I said in the previous video, I also mentioned that the deity is one of visions and oracles, and that the Genji tradition takes these visions and oracles seriously, and that the Genji tradition also has methods and teachings to bring the Genji samurai into contact with Hachiman, or to sort of cause visions of Hachiman, to commune with Hachiman. Now, this is, of course, only supposed to be done when one is faithfully supporting and protecting the Dharma, serving the Emperor, and is about to do something that is for great benefit and welfare of the people, and genuinely, needs intervention from Hachiman. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at Genji Yorimitsu's vision of the great Bodhisattva Hachiman. But also in a previous video, I had mentioned that we were going to take a look at Genji Mitsunaka and Genji Yorimitsu and Kusunoki Masashige in the Jino Shotoki. So let's take a moment to address that. Since I said I would do it, let's go ahead and do that. Now, unfortunately, the Jino Shotoki doesn't say much. Yorimitsu is not mentioned at all. Only his father, Genji Mitsunaka, is mentioned. So remember, Genji Mitsunaka and his son Yorimitsu are the beginnings of the Tada Genji tradition. These are the founders, father and son, founder of the Tada Genji tradition. The Jino Shotoki only records these two events concerning Genji Mitsunaka, the father. It mentions Mitsunaga's service to the emperor, serving as a shining example of successful service as a bushi. So even though it's only a brief mention, it praises Mitsunaka heavily, saying that he's essentially a great example of a proper samurai. It also references Mitsunaka becoming a Buddhist monk later in life. So he serves the emperor as a shining example of bushi, and then when he gets older, he becomes a Buddhist monk. Alright, well, since that's all that it really says about Genji Mitsunaka, and Jino Shotoki doesn't say anything about Yorimitsu, that's the end of us using the Jino Shotoki for these videos. So from here on out, when we're talking about Genji, we're going to be using the Tada Genji documents. But before we move on, let's take a moment to look at Kusunoki Masashige and the Jino Shotoki. Since so many of these things intertwine between Tada Genji and Kusunoki, let's see what it says about Kusunoki. Interestingly, it only mentions Kusunoki briefly, but this is actually very important and a good thing. Here's what it mentions. It mentions the defense of Chihaya Castle, but it only contains a few lines. It doesn't actually even say Chihaya Castle or Chihayaji. What it says is, roughly in English, is that a warrior named Kusunoki Masashige, filled with loyalty for the Emperor Go-Daigo, set up a fortification on Mount Kongo in the Kawachi province, from which he conducted military operations in nearby provinces. The Hojo shoguns, the Bakufu, the shoguns, sent an army from the Kanto, made up of forces from several eastern provinces, and sieged Mount Kongo. Masashige's defenses held, and the shogun, the Bakufu force, was unable to defeat his position. After this, the country fell into disorder. Now, the disorder that it's referring to is the fighting that ultimately leads to the Kenmu restoration, which, as we know, ended in a victory for Go-Daigo Tenno. So, basically what this verse is saying is that Kusunoki Masashige, fighting for Emperor Go-Daigo, took position on Mount Kongo, held it. The Hojo shogun sent a large force from the eastern provinces. They failed to take it, and because they failed to defeat Masashige, the war between the emperor and the shoguns was in full swing. So after that entry, we only see a small entry detailing that the Kusunoki family was summoned by Emperor Go-Daigo to protect him, to bodyguard him, to be a security force when he wanted to refortify himself in Yoshino during the late 1300s. This was around the time that Go-Daigo abdicated and Go-Murakami, his son, took over. Now it's important to note that in both of the fact that the Kusunoki appear in only these two small entries speaks to the larger truth, and that is that while the Kusunoki were direct retainers under Emperor Go-Daigo, serving as spies, scouts, black ops, guerrilla forces, and when it came to those sort of guerrilla tactics, they were the experts. But in the larger picture of the Southern Court in its totality, they were actually a fairly small factor in the totality. Now, over time, Kusunoki Masadori, Kusunoki Masahide would become, generals, and their place within the totality of the Southern Court would become larger and more important. But in the beginning, they were just a small family serving the emperor directly. Which is why they're not actually they're not really involved in a lot of the major decisions of the Southern Court. For example, the author of the Jino Shotoki, Kitabatake, outranks the Kusunoki. His say holds more sway in the Southern Court than anything that the Kusunoki could say. Now later on, during the late 1300s and into the 1400s, the Kusunoki become much more important. But for this point, they're not that important. Okay, now this is supposed to be a video about Yorimitsu, and so we will stop with Kusunoki, and we'll get back to Yorimitsu. So, we've seen in the first video talked about Hachiman Daibosatsu. So if you haven't watched it, watch it. You know who this deity is. We've talked about Genji Mitsunaka, Genji Yorimitsu, Kusunoki, because we tie these traditions together in the Jino Shotoki. Now we're moving on. No more Jino Shotoki. We're only going to talk about Genji Yorimitsu and the Tada Genji documents. So, some basics. Genji Yorimitsu, 948 to 1021 AD. Well-known and famous member of the Tada Genji line. While not as perfect an example of samurai service as his father Mitsunaka, Yorimitsu is still known for being very skilled, very capable, very intelligent. Being a Genji, but also being of the time period he was alive, he's extremely proficient with bow and arrow. He's also proficient with swords, horsemanship, etc., etc. So you should see him as being a proper bushi of his age and time. He was also a poet, and he also had deep political ties with the imperial court and the Fujiwara, as did his father. So the Genji at this time are basically the military arm of the empire, and they're even called the claws and the fangs of the Fujiwara. So you have the imperial family, then you have their regents, the court nobles, which is Fujiwara, and then you have the military arm, the guys that go in, kick ass, take names, the strong arm of the empire, if you will, and that's the Genji. Now, Yorimitsu's personal retainers are known as the four guardian deities of the four directions, the Shitenno. Shitenno means four heavenly guardians, or in this particular case, it doesn't translate out directly to heavenly guardians, but it's the kings of the four directions. So the four guardian deities of the four directions, or the four kings, the four heavenly kings, the four gods of the four directions. So that's a Buddhist term, but that's what his personal retainers had earned this title of Shitenno. Now, not only does Yorimitsu become important for the Tada Genji due to his entire life of service for the emperor, but there are several specific events which stand out. one, or ultimately a series of skirmishes with rebels. Now, by rebels, let's be honest, these are most likely non-Yamato Empire, so non-Japanese Empire people resisting the spread of the Yamato Empire. So remember, the Yamato Empire, Japan as we call it these days, the Yamato people, are indigenous Japanese groups that have, influence from China and Korea, and then they created the Yamato Kingdom, Empire of Japan, in the Kyushu area, and then they spread eastward into Honshu. So during this time period, during Yorimitsu's life, the these rebels are almost assuredly just people who are not joining the empire. And so that's one thing that most samurai are of the time period sort of are famous for, their battles with these sort of holdout groups. Now there is the specific group that the specific thing we're gonna talk about today is an event where Yorimitsu did a search and rescue mission to find a bunch of missing women and rescue them from a group of cannibal thieves living in the mountains. That's what we're going to focus on. But let's talk about what's interesting about these two events. The Tada Genji documents record these events as they happened. So real people, like real people fighting real people. But in over time, among non-Tada Genji Japanese people, just the general population, these events have become highly mythologized. So, for example, these sort of non-Yamato people rebelling could become called Tsuchigumo, or the Earth Spider demons. So, rather than just being like tribes that didn't join the Yamato tribe, like groups of people that were resisting the spread of the Yamato Empire, become the Earth Spider demons. And these sort of the thieves, the cannibal thieves living in the mountains, become oni, these human-eating ogres. So the Tada Genji tradition does not go with any of this mythology. It discusses like real humans fighting real humans. So obviously we're going to focus on that. So as I said, we're only going to be looking at the Tada Genji tradition, which are historical accounts. We know with cultural and religious teachings, but again, they don't discuss demons. They discuss real humans fighting real humans. So within this Genji history, there's three key points. One, the missing women. So a hurricane, tsunami, windstorm in the 990s. The exact year is slightly up for debate, but in the 990s, this massive storm hits, and then, there's a lot of women missing afterwards. Now, of course, during a storm, people are going to die, but there's a lot of women missing, no bodies. They're just not there. And Genji Yorimitsu is given the task to find out what's going on. We'll talk about that in more detail. All of these we'll talk about in more detail. This is just the overview. Number two, the vision of Hachiman Daibosatsu. So Genji Yorimitsu performs the prayers ritual to commune with Hachiman Daibosatsu, and he has a vision of the deity. The deity explains to him what he needs to do. He imparts new military strategies to him in the process. Part 3, rescuing the women. Yorimitsu and his retainers search the wilds, and they find the cannibal thieves. They defeat them, kill the cannibals, and they rescue the women. So those are the three main parts. So as I said, the initial event, after a horrible windstorm, tsunami, hurricane, this basically a bad weather event. People are left dead, there's damage, but there seems to be an unusual amount of missing women. No dead bodies, just missing women. The imperial court tasked their Onmyodo department. So their Onmyodo department is their Taoist department, the department of yin and yang. They do divination and paper spells and things like that. They tasked their Onmyodo department to divine the meaning. But they can only seem to divine that some dark force has taken these women deep into the mountains. That's it. Okay. Genji Yorimitsu is called up and tasked with finding these women. The only problem is nobody has any idea what has happened. The Onmyodo department believes dark forces took them. Okay? But who's the dark force? And where have they been taken? So Genji Yorimitsu is at a big disadvantage here. But he has to find these women. So he decides to do something his father, in the Tada records, is said to have done many times. Commune with Hachiman. So the vision. Yorimitsu secludes himself and conducts the ritual for Hachiman Daibosatsu. His father had done this many times, and this may or may not have been the first time that Yorimitsu has done it. The record isn't specific about it, but it seems like this is the first time, since there's no mention of him doing this previously. But like I said, we know that his father did it several times, so this is why Yorimitsu is doing it. Now Yorimitsu, so it succeeds. Yorimitsu has a vision of the Hachiman. The deity explains to him what has happened and also explains to him what new tactics that him and his retainers will need to use in order to succeed. He's instructed on a range of tactics, from tracking to investigations to find the women. He is also instructed on psychological tactics regarding how to trick and manipulate his targets in order to defeat them. So these teachings are what we know now as espionage and scouting skills. And these teachings are what we find in the Tada Genji tradition. And they eventually find their way into the Southern core traditions such as Kusunoki and Fukushima Ryu. Now again, I'm not saying that all of the espionage and all of the tracking comes from this, because we also know that the Genji get this material from the Chinese sources. So from the Jingunden teachings, we know that there is pre-existing Japanese black ops from the time of the fisherman scout of Emperor Jimmu. Right? There's some measure of Japanese espionage, Japanese black ops. And then we know that the Genji also studied the Chinese class, the art of war and the six secret teachings. Now on top of that are these Genji specific Hachiman Daibosatsu tradition teachings that get added in to create this Tada Genji tradition. During this vision, Hachiman Daibosatsu also makes it clear to Yorimitsu that Hachiman Daibosatsu is part of Amitabha's Buddha's compassionate display, that Hachiman Daibosatsu is a manifestation of Amitabha, a bodhisattva who's inseparable from the Amitabha Buddha. Now this goes also with the teachings that Hachiman is inseparable from Shakyamuni Buddha as well. And then there's Avalokiteshvara, and then there's Yakushin Nyorai. And so this teaching actually is very complicated. It's very complex and has lots of parts. But to simplify it, it's usually just taught in simple form to say that Hachiman Daibosatsu is a manifestation of Amitabha. Like I said, in the actual teachings it's more complex, but that's the simple explanation. Hachiman Daibosatsu is a manifestation of Amitabha Buddha. So there's now at the same time, so that's the vision with Hachiman. Now there's also mention in some versions of this story, in some records of this story, that Yorimitsu is approached later by three deities who provide him with some more instruction. Now it's unclear which three deities are involved. One theory suggests that it's the deities of the Orion belt, right? The star constellation, the Orion belt star constellation. There's another theory that says that it's the three goddesses of the Jingunden tradition. Now we haven't gone into that, but in the Jingunden tradition there are three goddesses that are the goddesses of the tradition. So, and then the final sort of theory says, or version says, that it's the three deities of the Sumiyoshi shrine. Now, if you remember, the three deities of the Sumiyoshi shrine are the three deities that appeared to Emperor Ojin's mother. Remember, Emperor Ojin is the incarnation, the human incarnation of Hachiman. So, before he was born, the three deities of the Sumiyoshi shrine appeared to the mother. So some people say that these three deities are those. Now, these three sets, the Orion belt gods, or the deities of the Orion's belt, the goddesses of the Jingunden tradition, and the three deities of the Sumiyoshi shrine, these three sets are actually pretty entangled in history. There are some traditions that say that they're all three the same three gods, like the Orion's belt is the three goddesses. The three goddesses are the Sumiyoshi. There's some that say that they're related but not quite the same. They're very entangled. So the thing to remember though is that each one of these explanations has its own meaning, and each one of these explanations can work for the purpose of passing down the tradition. Because the key point, and I put this in red, the key point is that it is a vision of Hachiman. That's the key point. The appearance of three deities later is not the key point. That may not even be part of the story originally. That could just be added on for symbolic purposes later. The heart of the story, the key point, is the vision of Hachiman Daibosatsu by Genji Yorimitsu. So Yorimitsu and his retainers, they scout, they track, they interview, they question, they investigate the land and people until they manage to locate the place where the cannibal thieves are. And yes, the cannibals, they're eating the bodies of dead women, right? And then having their way with the living women. It's a pretty horrible situation. Now, this is not just Yorimitsu and his retainers. And I'm going to admit that when I first heard this story, right, when I first became aware of this story, I imagined that it was just the five of them, right? It was Yorimitsu and his four retainers. But the Tada records are very clear. It's a small guerrilla force of about 50 people. So it's Genji Yorimitsu, his four direct retainers, and then about I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's about 50 people total, right? So there, it's not just five of them. There's actually a small guerrilla force with them. So most of this force stays hidden in the woods, waiting for Yorimitsu's signal. Yorimitsu and his four retainers then dress up as Yamabushi and approach the thieves. Now, I know on the slide it says dress up and Yamabushi. It's a typo. They dress up as Yamabushi, and they approach the thieves. And they succeed in convincing the thieves that they are Yamabushi who have broken their vows and have done lots of horrible things and are now criminals, and they want to join this group of thieves. It takes some silver-tongued devilry from Yorimitsu, but Hachiman Daibosatsu has trained him well. And once inside, the Yorimitsu and his men, they spend time learning the layout of the base, so to speak, and the number of the thieves, and they basically spend some time learning what's going on inside the thieves' den. So some of you may be familiar with the more mythological version of the story. At this point, there was the mention of poison, and that's where those three deities come in. Like after the vision, later on, when Yorimitsu's wandering the woods looking, supposedly these three deities come and they teach him some more, and then they show him how to make this poison. Now, whether the poison came from Hachiman, whether the three deities, whoever they were, showed him, or whether he had it before, is ultimately irrelevant. The Tada records don't make it clear, the origin of the poison. It just says that once they learned everything they needed to learn, they then set up for the attack. They poisoned the alcohol of the thieves. So basically all the booze gets poisoned, and then when everybody's like drinking, and people start feeling the effects of the poison, then Yorimitsu and his retainers signal the retainers that are outside. So these guys inside signal the 50-something guys on the outside. Then the 50-something guys on the outside begin to attack the thieves' den like full-on shock and awe, military SWAT team style. And while the thieves are fighting that, Yorimitsu and his retainers start making work of the people that are around them. And this is where you get the famous fight between Genji Yorimitsu and the leader of the thieves. So now in real life, the leader of the thieves he's a cannibal thief. He's a thief who likes to eat dead bodies or kill and eat people. And he's apparently like a big dude. He's very tough. He's really hard to beat. And Yorimitsu ends up killing him and cutting his head off. But he's such a bad dude. He's such like a tough SOB that he sort of gets remembered mythologically as being an Oni, as being an ogre. And he gets the name, and this is where his Shuten Doji comes from this. So in real life, he was just a very strong, very skilled cannibal thief leader. But in mythology, he becomes the demon, the Oni Shuten Doji. So the leader is beheaded and the skirmish is over. Yorimitsu and his men, they take count of the dead, they gather everything that they can about the names of the dead, etc., 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 and then they escort the living women back to Kyoto. Okay, so this story is not only important for the Tada Genji families who descend from Genji Yorimitsu, but it also serves as a very strong part of the Hachiman Daibosatsu teachings and the Genji military traditions overall. This is one of those key events or key points related to Genji Hijitsu, which means secret techniques. And this Hijitsu, as I mentioned earlier, would later go on to mix with Chinese warfare tactics to create this samurai black ops, such as shinobi, of the Tada Genji tradition. This was a small guerrilla group given a seemingly impossible task, but using these Hachiman Daibosatsu traditions, they were able to locate and rescue these women and take out an entire den of cannibal thieves while they were at it. And part of that is being able to trick their enemies into allowing them entrance into the group, to gather intel on the enemy strength from inside the camp, to communicate with outside reinforcements, and pull off the raid, the final attack. Now let's also take a moment to look at why it's important to note that Genji Yorimitsu was praised for using these tactics. There is no mention in any record of any of his deception or sort of sneak attack being considered dishonorable in any way. And this is honestly because the idea of espionage and black ops, the stabbing the enemy in the back, being dishonorable, this is not actually found among historic samurai culture. Alright, there's in the Heike Monogatari, there is actually a story about a Genji samurai who kills his enemy by pretending to be the enemy's friend. And then when the enemy finally sort of like lets his guard down, the Genji samurai kills him. And that is actually praised as being a clever tactic, And the thing is this: war is war. If you're serving if you're serving the emperor, then it is honorable. So within actual historical samurai culture, if you're serving your lord, you can do some pretty gnarly stuff, and it's considered honorable because it's done in the line of duty. Now, if you lie, cheat, steal, backstab outside of the line of duty, like if you do that stuff to your friends or, people that are supposed to be on good terms with you, your allies, then you're considered dishonorable. Then it's considered shameful. But to do these things to an enemy is not shameful. It's not dishonorable. And of course, naturally, this idea can be profound, but it can also be dangerous under the wrong circumstances. But that's the idea nonetheless. That is the reality of samurai culture. That's the reality of the Tada Genji tradition, of the Jingunden tradition. All of these things are horrible to do to allies, horrible to do to civilians, to bystanders. But if you are doing them to your enemy in service to your lord, in this case, in service to the emperor, then it's all fair. It's considered honorable. So we see these, like I said, we see these teachings not just in the Tada Genji tradition. They are Genji traditions, the Tada Genji tradition specifically because this is Genji Yorimitsu, the founder of the Tada Genji, right? But or him and his father are the founders of the Tada Genji tradition. So this is obviously a Tada Genji thing, but it doesn't just stay within Tada Genji. Like we talk about Kusunoki all the time. And in the Kusunoki tradition, we absolutely find some of the documents maintain some of these Hachiman traditions. Some of the more esoteric aspects. So within the Kusunoki tradition, we find a simplified version of the Hachiman Daibosatsu vision request, or that Hachiman Daibosatsu commune with Hachiman Daibosatsu tradition. It's a very simplified version of it, but it's there. And we also find several smaller esoteric sort of religious things related to Hachiman Daibosatsu within the Kusunoki tradition. And this makes perfect sense, of course, because as I've said many times over, Kusunoki Masashige studied both the Tada Genji and the Oe Genji traditions. And we see the espionage, the tracking, the psychological techniques combined with Chinese tactics. These two forces essentially create the main bulk of the Kusunoki tactics, which in turn make up one of the main traditions of the Southern Court Loyalist. So, and then in turn, we also see non-Genji Jingunden traditions, such as the Shotoku Jingunden, being influenced by this when their members begin to cross-train with these Tada Genji-based systems. So, we see the original material in the Tada Genji teachings, but then we see it as it spreads through things like Kusunoki, the Southern Court Loyalist, and we see it actually go into the Jingunden traditions as well, the other Jingunden traditions. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations, but please be respectful.